Hello, everybody. So welcome back to the idtalks. This year, we are talking about mental health and well-being of youth that are at the core of European Youth Goals and the European Youth Strategy. In 2023, SALTO Inclusion and Diversity Resource Center is partnering with the network of national agencies Mental Health in Youth Work project to contribute to the discussion on importance of youth mental health and well-being, as well as to highlight youth workers' role and in young people's well-being. So the entire year this year, we are going to produce idtalks under the year on mental health, with the spring edition running under the motto Understanding Mental Health, and the autumn edition will be devoted to discovering mental health practices. I would like to present now the team of the idtalks that is here today. My name is Anna, I'm from Armenia, I'm the facilitator of the idtalks. Here with me is Maria from SALTO Inclusion and Diversity Resource Center, one of the organizers of the idtalks, and we can also see there very comfortably Paavo from Finnish National Agency, our partners for this year's idtalk series. With me in the team, there's also Maria from our social media and communications team, and the most creative of us, what can we hide, Olaja, that we can have a glimpse into her creativity at the end of today's talk. Today's talk is very, very interesting and very, very special because we are going to talk about supporting young people's well-being. You, as youth workers, probably and hopefully are supporting young people's mental health and well-being. But what are young people's actual needs, and how can we identify and support these needs today? What kind of support young people with fewer opportunities need for their mental health? How we can create resilience strategies, how we can create sense of belonging and safe spaces in international context and at the local level. The person that we are going to discuss these questions today together is Anna Perović. She's a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and a mental health speaker. For many years, she has passion for psychotherapy, and this passion came from very valuable personal experiences. She's committed to this calling, and she's integrating psychotherapy, constructivist psychotherapy as primary psychotherapy basis in her work. Besides working in psychotherapy practice for 8 years, she also gives lectures, educates on mental health and well-being topics, different groups of people. Anna, it's our pleasure and honor to welcome you on the idtalks, and now the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's an honor to be here. And I'm very, very happy to see everyone is joined. Okay, please tell me, just organizationally speaking, we are ready to start, or we're waiting a few moments, ready to start? Okay, so just very, very briefly about myself. And what motivated me to speak today when I got the invitation. So I'm a psychotherapist and a clinical psychologist, and I worked with youth in various contexts. Some of them have been in my psychotherapy practice, and some of them have also been partially in youth work or supporting youth workers in their kind of in their work. And I have a sense that we as mental health professionals, and I always stress this out before talking about mental health in youth, we haven't really done justice to taking care of young people's well-being for a while. What I mean by that is that it was only, I think, in the 1970s that psychologists and therapists started recognizing that we should really take seriously the inner worlds of young people, and that their suffering can actually be very real and manifested in a slightly different way than it is in adults. And I love to take every opportunity that I get to speak about it and to kind of correct that or give my small contribution to it. So I'm going to share my screen and the presentation now. So the name of the topic that we chose for today's talk is supporting young people's well-being with specific focus on fostering young youth workers' competences in mental health domain. I was thinking about how to start this, and I started thinking about what a time it is to be young today. And I came across this article. Actually, it was a whole editorial in the Lancet magazine that quotes a scientist saying a person born in 2006 will have gone through the Great Recession and the subsequent austerity measures, a pandemic with disrupted schooling and social isolation, cost of living crisis, the war in Europe, and a world coming to terms with the magnitude of climate change. What a time to be young. And I do believe that we can talk about young people really today facing a world with multiple crises parallel to the developmental crisis that they may be, psychologically experiencing already. In addition to that, pressure and impediments are more significant and multifaceted, of course, with those with lesser opportunities, and we will tackle that later on. Before we begin, I believe this is quite clear to everyone, but I think youth is to be perceived as a somewhat vulnerable population when we talk about it from mental health perspective. What we mean by that is vulnerable populations can be defined by various characteristics and circumstances that constitute some risk factors to their mental health, but also create barriers to accessing adequate mental health care. And of course, it is quite clear, I believe, that youth are especially vulnerable because they find it more difficult to express their feelings verbally, and their emotional regulation capacities that I will talk about later on are a bit lower, and their competence to recognize what kind of support they need. Also, the ability to make safe decisions, and finally, the need to rely on others. Youth are very dependent on their environment, and therefore that makes them more vulnerable than some, let's say, more adult kind of part of our population. And so I believe what also kind of proves this vulnerability is unfortunately the statistics that are quite concerning these days. Mental illness affects young people, and the rate of poor mental health is increasing according to psychological research. Why we need to take it seriously is because it is estimated that 1 in every 7 young people, which here are defined by this age interval from 10 to 19, are affected by some kind of mental health challenge or a mental health illness. And yet they do remain unrecognized and are treated quite often. Also, World Health Organization reports that half of the mental health struggles start by the age of 40. Needless to say, COVID hasn't made it easier really for the youth, and we are still, I think, researching and figuring out the consequences of the pandemic on information and social relationships, and also different kinds of resources that youth was deprived of. I will very quickly go through this. I remember one of the first times when I saw the statistic and really took a moment to process it. Suicide is, according to the research, second or third, depending on the research, leading cause of death in the young people aged from 10 to 24. And therefore, obviously, the need to take it seriously and to be mindful of how can we prevent, or what kind of interventions can help us recognize how do these conditions manifest in youth is of great importance. when we say young people today, we mostly think from childhood to very, let's say, late adolescence. What psychologists would say, usually around the age of 20, is when we think 2024, according to some literature, is when the youth ends, according to their consensus. One of the most vulnerable age in the whole youth spectrum is the adolescence. And I here selected one quote, which I believe can be applied to all youth, so that it can maybe, but especially to adolescents, so that it can maybe help us understand what it is that makes this age so vulnerable. There is registered, so the research kind of found a heightened response in real or perceived stressors. And I'll take a moment just to make sure that this is clear. Real or perceived stressors, what it means basically is that we can have a stress response to whatever we perceive as threatening or somehow stressing, let's say, distressing to us. It doesn't have to be a threat to our life in order for us to perceive it as somewhat worrying. And the self-regulatory system that is supposed to, kind of help young people regulate this and hold the stress so that it doesn't overwhelm them, is compromised, and it's lower than in the adult. So we have heightened stress response and lower regulations capacity, which is quite difficult if you think about it to navigate. Furthermore, when we talk about the vulnerability of youth in terms of mental health, I believe it makes sense to mention that, yes, there are some protective factors and obviously some risk factors that we should bear in mind. I have chosen a few of them here, and in this classification, they are categorized through individual, then coming from like a very close caregiving environment, and then bigger context and environment. And I will list a few of them. And of course, if you want me later on to in any way specify more what they mean and how they can be also recognized, let me know. Obviously, when taking care or supporting youth in their mental health development, we want to make sure that we foster the protective factors and that we try as much as we can to eliminate or at least help them navigate the risk factors. Protective factors are interpersonal or pro-social skills, health literacy, meaning kind of knowing how to recognize health conditions, nutrition, physical activity, reading skills, sleep. Caregiver family protective factors, adequate social and emotional support, nurturing environment, social activity, friendships, environment context. Protective factors, access to community support services, supportive environment, access to appropriate mental health services, opportunities to serve as a volunteer are found by research to be quite protective, meaningful participation and feeling of belonging. And as I speak, you must bear in mind, of course, that these protective factors are not available to the same extent to all young people. Some of the risk factors, to go briefly: sadness or depression, anxiety, stress, chronic or severe mental illness, problematic use of substances, including medication, heavy alcohol consumption, smoking, chronic illness, poor nutrition, physical inactivity. Then coming risk factors in caregiver family context: isolation, lack of family support, limited social network. And then finally, environmental risk factors: low socioeconomic status, lack of support services, including transport, shopping, recreational facilities, limited mental health service, stigma and discrimination. And maybe this will be important to highlight here. According to some research, stigma, the effect of stigma as a risk factor is equal to the effect of mental illness symptoms. So stigma adds another layer of complexity to anyone dealing with mental health struggles. That's why actually talking about it is so crucial, language barriers. I will come back to this particular slide later on, but let me mention it now already. Young people with mental health conditions or challenges are particularly vulnerable to the following risk factors: social exclusion, discrimination, stigma, right? It affects the readiness to seek help, educational difficulties, risk-taking behaviors, physical ill health, human rights violations. So again, I listed a few of these, and feel free to note any of these down, or to later on ask me to come back to any of these slides if you wanted. Of course, my article will be available later on. I highlighted once again psychological and social protective factors, and I put in italic font some that I believe, and this is what I will talk more about in the later on in the presentation, some that we can affect and foster whenever we're working with youth, with young people, right? Some of them we cannot affect. Some of them are quite out of control of either mental health professionals or youth workers, but some could be supported even, through some smaller interventions. So reliable support and discipline from caregivers, how I interpret this, reliable support and boundaries. So care with boundaries is something I will come back to. It is something that we can try to offer whenever we can. Emotional self-regulation, I will talk about that in the aftermath. Subjective sense of self-sufficiency. So kind of empowering young people to actually use their own agency and to have trust in their internal resources. Positive self-regard. So I'm reading just the ones that I highlighted. Focus on making healthy food and beverage choices is obviously like a healthy habit. Participation in sports team, club, community, religious group, whatever the group is that can help foster a sense of belonging. Obviously, access to support services I didn't highlight, but to some extent we can maybe affect it by actually making some psychological first aid, so to say, a bit more available. Young people also, this applies obviously to the adults as well, but their vulnerabilities to mental health challenges can also be viewed in this way. When there is a lack of protective factors and there is a development of risk factors, there is very, very high chance that there will be some kind of a challenge in the mental health domain. So I'm talking about protective factors and risk factors, especially related to mental health that I just mentioned. Of course, they cannot be separated from protective and risk factors for our overall well-being. And I wanted to take a moment here and on this slide mention something I mentioned in the beginning of my talk today. It is common to believe that mental health challenges in young people are simply some kind of a developmental stage, or can be a mood that will shift, or can be, some kind of a transitional stage. And obviously, sometimes some of the mental health symptoms could be reactive to something that's happening to a young person, could be their way to adapt to something that's happening. However, in no way should we take it less seriously than we would in an adult person. And there is a big difference between living with a mental health disorder or mental health illness and having a challenging mood every now and then. And I'm noting it down here because, as I said, we are also responsible mental health professionals. I can speak in my name for actually taking so much time to really consider this more seriously. I will now go a little bit through some of the challenges that young people can either manifest or talk about. Obviously, I can in no way in the time that we have today go into clinical pictures, as psychologists call it, of every mental health condition that a child may have. However, I will try to cover some of them and give you some idea of maybe how you can recognize that there may be an underlying process or a background process to some behavior. In the Q&A, feel free to ask me to come back to any of this. Young people can manifest quite complex and different symptoms in mental health domain. Depression is definitely, as the statistics on suicide attempts and suicide tells us, depression is unfortunately one of the conditions that we should take very seriously, especially in young people who have a family history of depression or exposure to some sort of discrimination, or kind of have some sort of an ongoing risk factor in the domain of belonging. They can manifest, they actually have a high risk of depression, and they can manifest it in their day-to-day life. And how you can usually, we'll come back to this later, but you can usually start to recognize it is a child or a young person stops enjoying what they usually enjoy. So they cannot really find pleasure, or they cannot be playful. They are withdrawing from social interaction. And sometimes, and I will come to this later, but sometimes they will tell you that they have some sort of a physical pain. Because for young people, it is easier to talk about physical pain than the emotional pain. They sometimes struggle to make sense of their emotional pain. Obviously, in the domain of depression, very closely related are self-harming behaviors. And as usually, self-harming comes probably, as you know, in different forms as well, but it is a way to cause some physical pain, most likely to try to navigate some emotional pain that the young person is experiencing. Also very closely related to depression is suicidal ideation. And maybe important for you to understand that very briefly here, of course, I cannot go into too many details, but when we talk about suicidal ideation, sometimes we have either youth workers or even mental health professionals, we think that if we talk to a child about, or a young person, how they feel, and we talk about their sadness, and if we ask about whether when they say that maybe they want to take their own life, or maybe they think that life is meaningless for them, that if we inquire, if we go, if we get curious about it, then we can do some damage. That is a prejudice in a way that nobody is guilty of, but we are here to kind of maybe address it and deconstruct it. The more you give space for mental states to be spoken about, the less of a chance it is that a young person will act out on them. So it's totally fine to talk about suicidal ideation. It's totally fine to ask about it. Obviously, I will come back to this later on. As a youth worker, it is also very, very, very important to understand the limit of your capacity and your role, and to know when to forward the young person to a mental health professional. But it is not a taboo. And I believe that young people will confirm this if you try talking to them. Other examples of mental health conditions can be panic attacks, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, self-harming behavior, suicidal ideation, eating disorders, body dysmorphic disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, anger management problems. Again, I will not go into too much detail, but I can come back to any of it later on. Mental health promotion is based on the underlying principle that mental health is a positive concept, which is important in its own right, is of universal relevance, and is an intrinsic component of the broader health promotion and public health agenda. This is a quote from a World Health Organization article. I put this here as I believe it is maybe one of the, kind of overarching protective factors when we talk about this, to talk about mental health care as a value, as a concept, as something that we need to be educated about, the youth needs to be educated about, and that is of great value. Now we come to youth work and the role of youth workers in supporting young people's mental health. Youth work is mostly aimed, as some of you know better than me, at empowering young people's capacities and resources, as well as encouraging their active participation and inclusion in their communities and decision making. Furthermore, youth workers are ready to deal with the issues of societal change, environmental protection, but then when it comes to dealing with mental health, it seems somewhat unclear what their role is and what their role could be. I have come across this topic when I talk to quite a few of my friends and colleagues who do youth work. What is actually the role of youth workers in supporting mental health of youth? Are they specialized enough? Are they trained enough? Should they not go into that? Should they not inquire about it? I do believe that youth workers really are doing a tremendously important work in helping vulnerable young people face different kinds of life challenges and transitions. And I do believe that raising awareness and also empowering youth workers' competences in supporting mental health of youth can be extremely important and can actually empower them to provide more effective outcomes for young people. Obviously, this role needs to be a little bit more defined, maybe, and I will try to do this here. This is my understanding of how youth workers' role, what youth workers' role can be in when we talk about supporting mental health in youth. So I believe that youth workers understand the transition from childhood to adulthood and can validate these developmental challenges, the social pressures, this academic or employment challenges that the young person may face. They may encourage young people to report and talk about mental health difficulties. They can promote mental health and constructive coping skills, self-care as a value. They can educate themselves about mental health challenges of young people, right? Providing a safe relational space, and I believe maybe this is extremely important one for conversations around mental health. Learning about needs, experiences, protective and risk factors. Some of these we are talking about here today. Particular vulnerable and especially in particular vulnerable groups they're working with, promoting genuine care with clear boundaries. Each of these I will talk about more. Participating in mediation between young people and mental health experts. So I was thinking about what kind of skills youth workers can make use of, and I believe some of these have been covered by the trainings many youth workers receive. I tried listing here some that I find very important. I will go through them and then we can come back in the Q&A if I need to elaborate on any. Active listening to young people. In order to hold space for the young person, youth worker tries to facilitate conversation in a way that is curious, respectful, empathic, and responsive to young person's own communication style and language. Now, what I would recommend is asking open-ended questions, showing genuine interest and curiosity. If confused, ask, how can I help with this? Asking, how can I support you with this? Obviously does not imply that the youth worker needs to follow through with the answer, but encouraging young people, I mean, they do that within the boundaries and limitations of their role, but actually encouraging young people to verbalize what it is that I need, what kind of support can be very good for them. Paying attention to nonverbal cues in young people, learning to notice signs that the young person may be struggling with mental health. Creating a safe relational space for young people to feel seen. The youth workers try to create a space where young people feel heard, seen, and can actually talk about their own inner processes, be vulnerable, talk about their needs, challenges, and also acknowledge their mistakes. Because you see, safety is, psychologically speaking, safety means I am also owning a part of my own experience, and I'm kind of teaching the other person to also own their own experience and also sometimes their own mistakes, if any, because accountability and safety go hand in hand. Youth workers offer a kind and welcoming stance, show empathy and humanity, invite for collaboration. This can be interesting. So let's think this through together, right? I don't have a solution or a magical way of thinking of how to solve this, but I can ask you to talk with me, and maybe together we can do something. Validate young person's reality. Very important. I understand this may be difficult for you. I validate what is real for you. Promote agency and accountability. So let's think what you can do about this. Teach a young person that they are sharing, that what they're sharing is a vulnerable content, very important. Thank you for trusting me enough to share this with me. So I'm kind of labeling this as a vulnerable, maybe intimate content, and also teaching you that there is a trust needed if you want to share this with someone. Ask what helps a young person feel safe in a relationship. According to a study, our assessment practices, when we, as also clinical psychologists, when we try to assess how the young person is feeling, they need to be modified and developed and upgraded, because the way we do it sometimes actually scares young people to seek help. I believe that obviously it is not youth workers' duty to compensate for that, but it can be a wonderful thing if they can actually create a safe space where a child can express that they may need some help and then refer them further. These safe relational spaces, I believe, are a huge resource whenever we're talking about international projects, wherever we're talking about a young person on the move, for instance, in a refugee situation, or in any kind of uncertain or unknown environment. A safe relational spaces, so to know that it's safe to come to me and talk, or to this group of people and talk, can be a huge resource. Setting boundaries in a kind of respectful way. I will go quickly through this. I know that I don't have much time to go through it in detail, but when witnessing youth in vulnerable positions on a regular basis, it may be very difficult, not to feel called at times to actually engage in this savior role. I believe that it is very, very important sometimes for youth workers to establish, because they have this somewhat of a dual role, right? They offer some level of peer support, but at the same time, they are a little bit of a mentor figure. So to try to establish boundaries around different aspects of their role with themselves before they can present them to youth. So youth workers understand the value as well as the limitations of the role. Behave friendly, but not as friends. Follow the guidance on what kind of support they're offering to young people. Respect their own emotional boundaries, recognize when some topic situations feels too much for them, and always try to keep a young person's long-term interest in mind instead of a short-term gratification. And if there is time, I will come back to this one, especially because bearing this in mind, what kind of a message am I sending to the young person? What kind of capacity am I supporting? Long-term speaking can be very important. Self-regulation. In order to support anyone, we really need to take good care of ourselves. I know that the next talk will be on taking care of self-care in youth work, but I will just briefly mention that self-regulation really means noticing how am I feeling, what is my emotional state, normalizing and accepting these feelings, and utilizing some techniques to regulate. So to notice, what am I feeling? Is this somehow triggering me? Is my breathing change? Do I need to pause, journal about this, write down, or do some inner work? Because obviously as humans, we are going to react emotionally. Informed mediation between a young person and the mental health expert. As I said already, there is a clear distinction in that a youth worker's primary role is more of an intervention and prevention, unlike other mental health professionals. But I believe that they can really youth workers really can be an important stop and a reference point for a young person to get the help that they need. And I believe I will go again briefly through this. Some of the behaviors that I mentioned before that may be diagnostically relevant, that I believe you can also learn to observe as just someone working with youth. You don't have to be a mental health professional. You have to be a mental health professional to treat them, obviously. So irritability, like prolonged irritability, giving up on play or other forms of entertainment, frequent headaches, as I said, stomach aches. They can really, if it's an ongoing thing, it makes sense to check in on this young person. How have you been emotionally speaking lately? Self-deprecation, low self-esteem, self-harm, suicidal ideation, a sudden drop in school performance. And maybe of everything I want to tell you today, maybe this is the most important thing I can share. Take every personal confession of a young person seriously. That they are not well, that they do not enjoy anything, that they do not have a common language with anyone in the environment, or that they have a lot of worries. And refer to mental health professionals whenever possible. Obviously, sometimes young people can do that, as we know, to actually, sometimes they can, in a way, how would I even put it? Well, engage in some kind of manipulative behaviors around us, or just want something actually other than this, and then try to start a conversation by actually complaining about something. But I genuinely believe that it is always better to take it seriously, and if possible, get advice from a mental health professional on how to go about it, than to ignore it or to not take it seriously. Finally, empathy, a capacity to understand a young person's thoughts and feelings. Obviously, it's not a new capacity to I believe any of you, but what I think matters when we talk about youth is that empathy does not mean pity, taking a higher ground, or abandoning our own perspective. So I don't jump into another person's shoes or their perspective and completely self-abandon my own, or get lost in it or dysregulated in it. It can happen, obviously, but then we're not talking about empathizing, we're talking about something else. So the ability to hold my own perspective and yet imagine another's, and imagine how it may feel to be in the other's shoes, that's what empathy is. So how do young people feel in their skin? How much they understand what's happening in their community? What contributes to life satisfaction? Do they have any life ambition? Questions we can ask ourselves or have a conversation about. Empathy with young people with fewer opportunities. I believe an extremely important one as well. As we know, we all have similar needs, and we don't talk about different needs, but we don't live in the same realities as people with fewer opportunities, and those youth with fewer opportunities are quite often the youth that youth workers support. I believe empathy here, same way as with on my previous slide, empathy is trying to imagine what is the reality of this young person that I'm trying to support. And it is a very context dependent description. And I took a quote. This is, I think, a SALTO presentation, how to give young people with fewer opportunities a voice. It's a wonderful quote saying that obviously it is a very context dependent what we mean by fewer opportunities. And obviously there are some comparative disadvantages that would apply, that will make that would kind of qualify as fewer opportunities regardless of the context. But I do believe that it is, whenever we're supporting a young person, our ability to, in a respectful and empathic way, bear in mind what is the reality that this person is living in, is a fundamental basis of empathy. I will not go, I don't think I have time to go through all of these, but I believe that there are categories to young with people with fewer opportunities, and I named some of them here because again they describe, it's this, when we are a youth worker, it's this question, can I imagine what it feels like to face discrimination and yet, you know, not lose myself in trying to imagine and trying to feel what it feels like. So its empathy is aimed at connecting better with the youth. Also, it is aimed at understanding that maybe we find it difficult or overbearing to deal as a youth worker with some of the experiences and topics, which is perfectly fine. Some of the questions, to go briefly: how safe or seen does this person feel in their environment? Does this young person have certain accessibility needs that are met or not met in their daily environment? Is this young person living with minority stress? Does this young person receive discriminatory comments, messages of inadequacy on a regular basis? Is this young person living with a pervasive emotional pain or a sense of helplessness? What helps this person remain hopeful about life? Empathy with young people with fewer opportunities, you know, also is kind of sometimes a topic that may lead, if we don't take very good care of ourselves, to some level of compassion fatigue. And I'm going to just briefly, before we start to wrap up, mention acknowledging that the support you provide is good enough and that the space you hold for the youth is sometimes, I often hear that to be able to speak safely about their inner experiences is such an exceptional experience for young people. And I believe we sometimes forget about the value of this. Reflect on your emotional response, very important, because it may trigger some of our emotional pain or wounds, and you know, better to address them and recognize them, share them with a coworker than get them bubbled up inside. Extend compassion to yourself. We build resilience against compassion fatigue and burnout by knowing that we need that care and compassion ourselves. I believe as a part of youth workers' resilience strategy, I really wanted to make sure that this is mentioned. It is important to normalize occasional feelings of anger, frustration, helplessness in youth workers, as well as mobilizing and transforming them into individual, meaningful, collective action. I think this is very, very important to normalize it, because witnessing the slow, unjust, and oppressive systems is quite an emotional roller coaster sometimes. Resilience is frequently associated with optimism or positive outlook, but it is actually sometimes a misconception. Being resilient is the capacity we build, and it doesn't in any way, spare us of the hardships. It's actually about fostering protective factors and coping skills and safe relational spaces so that they can help us bounce back or overcome adversity or navigate it as a young person in the best way we can. The youth worker kind of is quite similar what resilience in a youth worker is as well. And I will repeat once again that I believe there is, this is where youth workers' contribution has a significant role in the young people they work with. And finally, supporting youth resilience involves helping them bring forth their inner capacities, willpower, and agency to constructively meet life challenges, navigate adversities, and thrive given unique characteristics, goals, and circumstances. And I think that this, as long as we are trying to be in this direction with our interventions, I think we're most likely doing an important work. And this is it. I would speak much longer, but I think I should pause for a moment.
Oh my God, Anna, thank you so much. And actually, maybe you didn't do it deliberately, but the end of your presentation blends so nicely into the last topic of idtalks for the spring that will be in 2 weeks from now, because in 2 weeks from now, we will be talking about youth workers' mental health and how to still be able to support others while protecting and taking care of yourself as a youth worker. Thank you so much for bringing and bridging these two topics together nicely in the end. Now, we have had some reactions in the chat from now. and a couple of questions. Maybe we can go through these questions first, and then we will be breaking into smaller groups to discuss still a bit the input. I know there was a lot of input, and Anna, you did an amazing job trying to squeeze it really into these 45 minutes that we allocated to you. But we have shared a couple times the slides of Anna's presentation. Feel free to go back to them, because there is so much learning that you can still have going through them on your own. So the two questions, first one is not really a question, but rather a comment from our colleague from Finnish named Paavo. Paavo says that he thinks coping skills can be learned. Youth workers can actually help a young person be aware of different ways of coping with stress and guide them to try out which ones are suitable for them. What's your take on this? Can really youth workers offer this support, and to what extent?
Absolutely. I believe that also, in a way, we should not mystify either coping skills or the resilience. I believe both can, in a way, be fostered and learned. What we mean by coping skills, so we kind of, you can think about it in this way. Life gives us event situations, the relational situations that somehow may trigger or cause or provoke a reaction in us, right? So how do we learn to be curious about it, pay attention to it, name what is my reaction, and also not feel too destabilized or too overwhelmed by it? It is a capacity, it's a set of skills, and I believe we could do a whole webinar on it, but I'll try very briefly. It goes really in this order. If you think about it as a skill, it's about getting curious, paying attention, naming what I'm feeling, and this sometimes is where youth needs support, and youth workers can be of support. Sometimes saying to a young person, "It looks to me like you are upset," can offer a cue for them to actually either get curious about something they're experiencing or actually get a name for it. Third, or fourth, depending on how you count, thinking about, okay, so now as I become aware of this, what it is that I need? Do I need to take a breath or a pause? Do I want to, I don't know, express this emotion somehow in a constructive way? No emotion is bad. And I'm not a fan of talking in terms of positive and negative emotions. I believe emotions are a signal, and it is what we do with them that can be more or less constructive. So what can I do about this emotion in a more constructive way? Is it anxiety? Do you need to calm down? Is it sadness? Do you need a time for it? I may need to cry, I may not. Is it anger? Okay, let's do something about the discharge of some of this activation that's in me. Absolutely a set of skills. And I believe youth workers can do some part of it, obviously. Again, I'm fully aware, I don't want to put on the responsibility of a mental health care worker on a youth work, but some of it I believe can be done.
And Paavo is sending you like a screen big thumbs up. So thank you very much. We have an interesting question from Niels here in the chat. Niels is a volunteer from Germany doing his service in Armenia, and a regular visitor of idtalks. He's asking, if we notice a youngster struggling with mental health issues and talked with them in order to create a safe space for them and recommended them to seek professional help as well, but they refuse to do so in a fear of being misunderstood or stigmatized, maybe even, what can we as youth workers do in order not to betray their trust, but still be able to give them some appropriate way of support?
Wonderful question. So I'll try to answer it. I don't think there is a one way to answer this, but how I can put it, as if maybe a way to imagine it also can be, how would you support a person that is dear to you and that you care for, and that is, a bit resistant to actually asking help? So what do you do? Not the most convenient, not the easiest role, especially if you're a youth worker and you're working with a young person and there is a sense of responsibility in a way. So I believe that, especially with youth, it really matters that we stay present as a support and a safe space. So we, even if we start to feel a little bit of frustration, or maybe they're not doing what we think that's good for them, or what we offered, or we truly believe they should go for, mental health care or psychotherapy or whatever is available, but they're still not choosing to do it. Do not abandon them for that. Do not leave. I don't think anyone would really do it, but I think it matters that we stress it out. Don't emotionally leave. Stay in the space with them as patiently as you can. And how I sometimes say, and I remember one occasion where I had to say it to someone I was working with, I will always stay on the side of your well-being and on life affirmative actions, right? However, I can only remind you that I care of it and that I hope that, you do what's good for you. I will not force you or coerce you or whatever. It is not my job, and it is not within also my boundaries. But I will be, this space where you can check in and I can remind you that I really care. This was a situation that was a bit more serious, so I had to say things along the lines of, I will always advocate for your life and well-being, because it was a difficult situation that the person was in. And that is the side that I will be on. And I understand that maybe at this moment we don't feel that we are on the same side, but I'm not going to force you. I'm here as a reminder. And I believe that sometimes it really is the best we can do. Again, I also understand that there are circumstances that we may be extremely worried about someone, and this young person is in no way willing to take care of them. I will, in that way, I believe you would know this better than I would. I would think about within the organization that youth worker is working with, what kind of rules or guidelines we have around this, and I would get advice from someone on how to approach it. What is my responsibility, and can we in any way bring this person closer to the resources, or advocate for it on some more serious level. But if I'm talking about one-on-one relationship with youth, it's difficult sometimes to stay there with their resistances, but I believe it's more useful always to stay there than to leave in any way, if that makes sense.
Okay, the questions keep coming, and we are not even sure. We have this background chat with the team whether to go into these breakout rooms or not. We're not even sure whether to do it or not. I still believe we could go to the breakout rooms at some point, because then more people would have an opportunity to share their impressions from this from this talk, from this input. Niels is saying thank you for answering his question, and I will quickly ask maybe 2 more questions before we break into the rooms, and then we can take more questions if they come in. So one is about setting boundaries, and how can we assure, Zoe is asking, that while setting boundaries, the young person is not feeling as a burden, that they are like they are annoying or something. So this is one question, and another one maybe I can ask, then you can answer in whichever order you prefer. Maria from SALTO has rightfully noticed that today in the audience we have quite many international volunteers that are doing their volunteering away from home. So could you say maybe a bit about how, in your opinion, volunteering can be a protective factor, or can it be?
Okay. Yeah.
So these 2 questions before we go to breakout rooms. But if more questions are coming in, dear participants, please put them in the chat. If we cannot address them during the talk today, we can forward it to Anna. Maybe she can include your questions into her article. So please, Anna. your take on these two questions?
Great question. So how do we set boundaries and at the same time try to do it in a respectful and kind way so that the person does not feel like a burden? The easiest way to answer it, if you're setting a boundary, I assume you are in a way advocating for something, right? So when you say, this is what I can do, maybe this is what I cannot do, or this kind of behavior is okay, but this kind of behavior really is not okay. There must be a value that you can think of and behind this process. What I mean by value is you can attach a boundary, I believe most boundaries, to some kind of a value. Let's put it like this. I want to say that what I can offer is this, but what I cannot offer is this to someone. If you wish, you can say that I'm being ethical, responsible, and humble because I am not able to offer whatever I wish and whenever I'm asked to. So I kind of attach it to, let's say, for instance, some level of responsibility and humility. So I may say things like, listen, I thought about this, and it really is important for me that I can follow through with whatever the request is or whatever the behavior is, with respect to my own boundaries and either my own humility or my own humbleness, whatever you choose to call it, or my ethical guidelines. And this is something that this is the reason why I'm choosing to set a boundary here. It can be self-care. It can be, for instance, there was an example when I was talking to a friend of mine that's a youth worker. Very briefly, a young person was asking. There was an example, I think it happened to another youth worker, but nevertheless, a young person was asking for a phone of this youth worker to call an unknown person. And actually, the example was an example of where the youth worker kind of regretted what they did, but right, nobody's perfect and we do make mistakes. So they gave without knowing who they're going to call. So what could have been done in that situation, I really care for your safety, and I'm not really willing to give you my phone to call someone who I don't know who that is. And I would maybe need to have a different kind of conversation with you around it. It is not about you being a burden. It is about me advocating for some value, or if you think about it, it can also be a long-term benefit. I hope this makes sense. A second question.
It makes very much sense. Please, the next question.
Yeah. The next question was, volunteering is a protective factor. I believe that the researchers, if you're referring to the slide that it was on, meant that volunteering is seen as a protective factor in psychology because it actually can make our a person feel like they have more of a sense of purpose and sense of meaning in what they do. And actually it is, even if you if you read through some guidelines and kind of creating a more meaningful life or bring more purpose, volunteering it can be a very big resource. How it is protective is protective in a way that I actually can feeling of purpose and feeling that I'm taking some meaningful action can be very closely tied to my own well-being. I hope that answers.
Thank you very much. And we are back from the groups. I would like to ask now, group by group, just to very briefly tell the question or the comment that you came up as a group. What is one thing that you would like to address to Anna now? And let's collect from all the rooms before we give Anna an opportunity to respond, because maybe some of the questions will be similar or will be repeating it themselves.
Yeah, hi guys. I think one of the things that was interesting at the end, maybe for Anna, I think Cecilia came up with something from Portugal. Cecilia, do you want to explain about that safe space? I thought it was really good what you said. Can you hear me, Cecilia?
Yes, I can. Do you hear me?
Sorry
Yes,
for
we
putting you on
hear
the spot.
you. Please,
Yeah.
please, Cecilia, you have the floor.
Yes, I shared our difficulty to create a safe space for the youth to come to us, and that well, I work for the municipality, and our outreach isn't very good. So many of the youth don't even know that we exist and that there is a service that cares about them, and yeah, and that they can go to. That's it.
Okay.
Okay, Anna, please take some notes for yourself, and then we will collect more questions,
and then we come back.
We come back
Sure,
to
sure,
all
sure.
of them together.
Mhm.
Thank you very much from your room, and let's go to another one. Who has questions or comments that you would like to voice now? Other rooms, other groups? No?
Well, I'm from the same group actually, but I would just like to comment on well, I'm very grateful for the information you provided, because it gave me like a way better understanding of my role actually as a volunteer when it comes to mental illness, and yeah, I just want to be grateful that you also say that we are of course we are not professionals, but we're still valuable in that case, right? And maybe even we also talked about it, we could maybe even be the only person for kids to talk to. And of course this is a big well, big thing on our shoulders to carry, right? But I think it's still very nice to know that we are like valuable in this case, and even though we don't have much profession, we can still do a valuable participation in the education of the kids this term.
Thank you very much, Colin. And just before we listen to some more questions, maybe we will be launching now a short poll. We needed to understand a bit how you feel about our idtalks series this spring. So please take a moment to also fill in this poll before we will be closing the day. Still, we have about 10 minutes. So any other questions? Maybe we can take one more question or comment before we give the floor back to Anna.
Okay, yes. Can you hear me?
Esther, please.
Okay, so working with our kids, I mean, it's often also not just in a kind of informal education environment, but also there's a lot of fun involved and a lot of joking around with each other. So how do we approach this to make it a more safe space, especially when some people may be worried that their peers don't really take their struggle seriously, so they don't even think about like maybe sharing with us some of the struggles they're facing, just because they don't think that their peers would like really see it as an issue and maybe invalidate their feelings in a way.
Great question.
Yeah, and this is actually very much in line with the question that Esther had asked in writing before. And maybe also to say to you volunteers that Terry is writing some compliments to the work and the skills that you are bringing. Anna, maybe because we are out of time. Hassan?
I have a question. Yeah, thank you. Yes, this is Hassan from Sweden. And my question is, at what time do you have to consult an expert? Like if you have a volunteer who is having mental issues, and so at what time do you make a judgment and to see like maybe you need an expert for an intervention? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you very much for your question. Do we have any more? Because I'm really about to pass the floor back to Anna to give her at least 5 minutes to address these questions. Yeah, let's go back to you, Anna. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to add them in the chat. We will make sure these questions are forwarded to Anna after today's ID talk. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you. I believe that the first comment, I was not sure if there was a question involved, but I am familiar with how it may be difficult for the outreach teams to actually get some visibility, and also to get for I guess the organization to get visibility among young people. And I as a therapist and someone who's worked also in youth work, I can only tell you that I deeply empathize with it. I believe that it is sometimes frustrating that you cannot really feel like that there's enough of visibility. I remember I was coordinating some teams in refugee camps, and even within a refugee camp, it was a big camp, it was a struggle to get the visibility and to actually teach children about resources. I have no solution for it other than to actually maybe think of channels that young people use to get some information, and either if it's something you can spread around in paper or printed form, or it's something you can do through digital media. As you probably know better than I do, it's about actually getting all the visibility you can in the channels that they are using. And I believe actually I remember this case from years ago. Teams were literally walking around sometimes and mapping groups of young people and started a conversation with them. I have no idea if that's possible in the area that you work with. And safe spaces, why I focus on relational spaces, because I'm very much aware that sometimes physical spaces are not as safe or perceived as safe, but I have a sense that a relational space can be a resource to feel safe, even in a very uncertain, unknown environment. And I can remember also from this experience that now comes to mind, being in a huge refugee camp with so many, among others, young people and children going around, and there was a huge circulation, actually finding just one quiet spot and sitting down with a young person and actually making them feel like they matter could have been was a resource and can be a resource, as sometimes as small as it may sound in the face of bigger adversities. To go to this was my reference to the first one. To go to the second one, thank you for your comment about actually highlighting the value that youth workers have. I genuinely believe that youth workers are a very valuable resource, a very valuable stop and a reference point, as I said, for young people. And I am fully aware that they their role cannot be the one of a mental health care professional. But it's this thin, this delicate line where actually you obviously cannot have the responsibility of a mental health care worker, but at the same time you witness so much of what's going on in the inner world of young people, and you can witness it and possibly create more safer spaces, sometimes the mental health professionals. This is from my experience, and I think it's a huge value. Again, it would be such a lovely thing to have more of interdisciplinary validation in this sense. I am there was a question. Yeah, it's a great question. If you imagine that there's a lot of activities that youth workers, and you don't have to imagine, but for the sake of this example, if I imagine correctly, a youth worker working with a group of young people, whatever the activity is, and being aware that there may be some members of this group, or most of them, or a few of them, doesn't matter, that actually could be somehow struggling, or could be somehow youth with belonging to the group, fewer opportunities. And actually the question is, how do we even start this conversation, right? How do we even start the conversation about the possible struggle in the mental health domain? It's a big question. It's a question I ask myself on a daily and weekly basis in whatever I do. I believe a good thing, if you want to open a vulnerable space or a space where it's safe to be vulnerable, is to go for, and you can pick, any of these that feel comfortable and that you feel are within your boundaries, professional and personal. You can actually just start a conversation with some information or passing on some knowledge about mental health. You can maybe tell some story you feel comfortable sharing about someone, that is close to you or yourself, or just something you read about. You can use art, you can use books or stories or movies. You can use TV shows that maybe youth are watching more than reading books these days, but you can use a character and their story and their experience and start a conversation and say, hey, I've been watching the series, or even suggest that you can maybe watch it together. Obviously, again, with respect to you have to be careful with the choice sometimes, but actually it's a good conversation starter. And also, in a way, if you feel comfortable to open up some story that from your life, that can show just that it's safe to be vulnerable around something, and that's a good conversation starter. A question is a good conversation starter, but not always with youth, and not always with especially shy or insecure youth. So maybe something like this. I remember a project that I was a part of. It was a long time ago. I don't think, unfortunately, this is that applicable, but I'll give you an idea. Sometimes with people in high schools, we were watching movies and talking about them. And sometimes we even took a guest speaker, usually a psychology student would go along. There was a volunteer, sometimes me, with a person who's suffering from some mental health illness. And we would talk with young people. That's not easy to organize, and you need a lot of logistics around it. But actually, this person opening up about their mental health struggles ended up starting such a fruitful conversation with youth. Some of them were youth from fewer opportunities. Some of them, for the first time, started talking about their mental health that time. So maybe I give you some ideas of it. I hope some of it at least helps. Maybe with some very vulnerable youth, I guess you're right. It's not a safe space usually in a group. So one-on-one or some group activity where we can maybe even talk about someone else's experience, but that can be applicable to that particular young person's experience as well. They will get it.
And the last question of Hassan about when is the right time to redirect to professional?
It's a great question, and obviously, it's not an easy one. What I couldn't give today, and I think somebody wrote it in the comments. I saw there needs to be maybe more mental health related training for youth workers, so that you can actually know in more detail than I can offer today, or could have offered today, what it really looks like when a young person is struggling. And then if you notice, if you want, diagnostically speaking, clinical psychologists have lists of symptoms, and then when they check some of them, they say, oh, this may be diagnostically relevant. Now, you as a youth worker, obviously I'm not going to do a clinical assessment, but maybe if you want to inform yourself on this, you can maybe look up what does depression in young person of this age look like, and if they're meeting a few of those that criteria, I believe that's a good enough reason. I would always go for prevention rather than intervention. So even if you can include an expert, in the earlier you can, the better. But obviously, it is not your job to do clinical assessment. It can be your job to know a little bit about what the symptoms are that the mental health care worker will bear in mind in order to do the clinical assessment. So if you notice 1, 2, 3 of them, can be an good thing to reach out to an expert. I hope this answers. If you need more clarification, you can write to me.
Anna, this is so great that I think we wouldn't mind staying another 1.5 hours, but unfortunately our time is coming to an end. And here comes this moment when I will announce Olaja and invite her to share her work with us and give us a couple of sentences on it.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me as always. Just checking the
We
technological
can
side.
hear you. Yes, yes, yes.
And you should also be seeing my screen now with a little recap of Anna's input. That was super intense, as you mentioned. Like, definitely go back to the slides because it's full with information and details and tips and tricks. So here I was only able to put the main titles, let's say, and subtitles of every recommendation that we have gotten today. Super useful, I believe, from the point of view of anyone who works with young people. So yeah, there is an empty space that I have just filled in while the questions were being answered. So as always, you will also receive the final version of this visual recording in a few days in your emails.
Yes, and that positive attitude and the smile of Anna is very well captured in her picture there on the frame. Thank you very much, Olaja.
This is amazing. Thank you.
And if you could stop sharing the screen, we could give back the words to Anna to say some final words before we call the day.
I just want to thank everyone for wonderful questions. I promise that I will make sure that I receive all that have been unanswered or unaddressed and try to incorporate it into the article. I also believe this is a conversation that we need more of these kinds of conversation, and I'm fully aware that 45 minutes is not enough to address it, but I'm actually very happy that we had the opportunity to address as much as we could. And thank you. I support you to take good care of yourself, and also to just, you know, be aware of your value as youth workers or anyone working with young people in actually just allowing this topic of mental health and to be less of a topic that that's a taboo, or that's, you know, something we are ashamed of, or that we attach some guilt or inadequacy to. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and to our audience here or on YouTube. In 2 weeks from now, on Wednesday, 1 p.m. Central European time, as always, we will be meeting for one last time this spring to close the Understanding Mental Health series, talking about youth workers' mental health with Natalia Gudakowska. So we really hope to see you back in 2 weeks. And thank you so much, Anna, for an incredible input and very interesting content. Goodbye, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.